It had been 8 years since Daniel and I stood in front of our friends and family, promising forever. For the most part, we'd lived in a rhythm: work, dinners, occasional weekend trips. Comfortable, predictable, maybe too predictable. Lately, I'd caught him zoning out mid-conversation, fingers tapping his phone more often, the faint glow of the screen lighting his face late at night when he thought I was asleep. When I asked, he'd smile and say it was just work. But I knew when a smile was an answer and when it was a shield. It started casually, almost like a joke. One night over wine, Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Ever thought about doing something different?" he asked. I laughed, thinking he meant a vacation, maybe skydiving. But his voice dropped lower, slower. "Something involving other people." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for the punchline. It didn't come. Instead, he shrugged like it was nothing. "Just a thought, a fantasy." I tried to brush it off, but the way he held my gaze made my chest tighten. Over the next few days, the tension stuck with me. He was still distracted, still spending long stretches on his phone. But now I caught glimpses of names lighting up the screen: Clara, Sophie, Maya, and once Liam. People I knew. People we'd had dinner with, laughed with. I told myself it was coincidence, that he was probably arranging something innocent, but the coincidences kept piling up. Short, hushed calls when I walked into the room. Sudden grins at messages he didn't share. A week later, he brought it up again. This time, not as a passing comment. "What if," he said, "we tried something together? No strings, no feelings, just fun." My stomach twisted. "With who?" I asked, already dreading the answer. He named them 4 people, all familiar. He said it lightly, like it was some harmless dare. "We just meet up, talk, see where it goes." He insisted there were no intentions beyond conversation. His tone was casual, but his eyes betrayed excitement, almost relief at saying it out loud. Part of me wanted to shut it down immediately, to tell him it was disrespectful, reckless. But another part, the part that remembered the monotony, wondered what would happen if I didn't. I hated that I even considered it, hated that the idea lingered in my mind long after we stopped talking. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling and asked myself whether curiosity was a form of betrayal. The following days, Daniel was more affectionate than he'd been in months. Small touches in the kitchen, surprise coffees at my desk. It felt almost like when we first started dating, except I couldn't ignore that it was fueled by something else, something brewing beneath the surface. His charm made it harder to say no, made me question whether I was overreacting. He talked about the group as if they were just friends catching up, nothing more. But there was a spark in his voice every time he mentioned them, and I knew it wasn't about friendship. When he finally suggested a date for this get-together, I didn't answer right away. I thought about Clara's confidence, Sophie's quiet glances, Maya's unpredictable energy. I thought about Liam, his best friend, being in the mix, which somehow made it feel more dangerous, more intimate. My instinct screamed not to go, but my silence seemed to be the permission Daniel was waiting for. He smiled, kissed me on the forehead, and said, "You'll see, it's harmless." That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror long after Daniel fell asleep. My reflection looked the same, but my marriage didn't feel the same. There was a shift I couldn't name yet, a line he'd drawn in the sand and invited me to cross. I told myself I could handle it, that nothing had happened yet, that I was still in control. But deep down, I already knew that once we stepped onto that path, there would be no way to turn back without losing something we couldn't replace. The next morning, his phone buzzed again. This time I didn't look away. Clara's name flashed on the screen, followed by a message. "Can't wait to see how this plays out." My hands tightened around the coffee mug. He caught me staring, grinned like it was nothing, and asked if I wanted to grab dinner out that night. I said yes, but the word tasted different leaving my mouth. The foundation of our marriage had just shifted, and I wasn't sure if it was cracking or changing into something unrecognizable. Either way, I knew the first step had already been taken, and there was no undoing it. The night of the so-called get-together arrived with an unease I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just a social evening, but the undercurrent was obvious. From the moment I stepped inside, conversations carried a hidden charge, smiles lingered too long, and there was an almost unspoken acknowledgement that we were all here for something that wasn't being said out loud. Daniel moved through the space like a host, laughing with each of them. His charm spread evenly but intentionally. Every so often his hand would rest on a shoulder, a waist, just long enough for me to notice and just short enough for it to be deniable. I tried to blend in, to play the part of the easygoing wife who was in on the joke, but inside my thoughts tangled. Watching Clara tilt her head toward him with that knowing smirk, or Sophie's fingers brushing against his arm when she laughed, felt like watching threads of my marriage slowly unravel. Daniel wasn't even hiding it. In fact, his eyes sought mine every now and then, as if gauging my reaction, testing how far he could push without breaking me. At one point he vanished into another room, leaving me with Liam, who made casual conversation, but kept glancing toward the hallway. When Daniel returned with Sophie, they looked as though they had just shared something private, nothing obvious, but a subtle shift in the way they stood next to each other. He poured me a drink without meeting my eyes, a silent gesture that was supposed to smooth over what I'd just seen. The days that followed blurred into a series of unexplained absences. He'd mentioned grabbing drinks with the group, but never invite me. Once, he came home smelling faintly of a perfume I didn't recognize. When I asked, he said it must have been from a crowded bar. His explanations were always neat, believable. Enough to make me second-guess myself, but the doubts kept piling up. I noticed he had new clothes I hadn't seen him buy, subtle changes in his grooming, the kind a man makes when he's preparing for someone to notice. One evening, while he was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. I told myself I wasn't going to look, but curiosity pushed past my restraint. It was a voice note from Clara. I pressed play, her voice low, intimate. Last night was unforgettable. Same time next week? My hands trembled as I locked the phone and set it down exactly where it had been. When Daniel emerged, towel around his waist, I asked directly. His expression didn't shift, no guilt, no surprise. It was just fun, he said. Nothing serious, no feelings. You knew. This was a possibility. That was the moment I understood his fantasy wasn't about testing boundaries together. It was about him creating a world where my discomfort was part of the thrill. He wanted me close enough to see but powerless to stop it, to blur the line between my consent and his control. He spoke about it as if it were harmless, as if crossing that line meant nothing because it was only physical. But the distance in his eyes when he said told me he'd already detached himself from what we had. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how quickly he could shift between roles: charming husband in public, attentive partner when I pulled away, and then something entirely different when he thought I wasn't looking. His phone became an extension of his hand, and every message from one of them seemed to feed him in a way I no longer could. I realized I wasn't competing with just a fantasy anymore. I was competing with the version of himself he got to be. When I wasn't around, I didn't confront him again right away. I wanted to see how far he'd go without interference. And he went further. Later, I overheard a conversation between him and Maya, her laugh followed by his low reply. Get used to it. That sentence lodged itself deep in my chest. This wasn't about me agreeing or disagreeing anymore. It was about him assuming my silence was acceptance, mistaking my hesitation for permission. By then, I'd stopped feeling jealous. What replaced it was colder, sharper, a realization that my role in this wasn't to stop him, but to decide. When I was done watching him destroy what we'd built, he thought he was in control, but every step he took with them was a step away from me. And I knew, even if he didn't, that soon there would be no way back to where we started. The night I moved into the guest room, Daniel didn't even ask why. He hovered in the doorway for a moment, watching me fold clothes into a drawer that wasn't ours, then walked away without a word. That silence told me more than any confession ever could. Something in me had already shut off, the part that reached for him in bed, the part that believed our promises still meant something. I wasn't angry in the explosive way I'd imagined. It was quieter, heavier, like a door closing. In my mind, Rachel called a few days later, her voice hesitant. She said she'd been holding something back but couldn't anymore. She'd seen Daniel 2 weeks earlier, stepping out of a hotel with Maya. Not the group, not a party, just the two of them. She'd wanted to tell me then, but thought maybe. I already knew. I thanked her, though my stomach felt like stone. The truth wasn't shocking anymore, but hearing it confirmed by someone else stripped away the last layer of doubt I'd been clinging to. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. His expression was almost defiant, like a man caught speeding who insists the limit was too low. It wasn't just them, he said finally. Liam was part of it sometimes. Things happened, it wasn't planned that way. His tone made it sound casual, like talking about a weekend gone off script. But in those few words, the scale of it shifted. It wasn't a single slip. It was a pattern, an entire reality he'd been building without me, one I was never meant to fully understand. I asked him why. Not why he wanted it, not why those people, but why he thought it was worth dismantling us for. He said it wasn't about dismantling anything. He talked about thrill, about feeling alive, about not wanting to live the rest of his life wondering what he'd missed. He said it like I should relate, as if the idea of betraying someone you love could be reframed as self-discovery. I realized then that we weren't speaking the same language anymore. His version of love allowed for betrayal if it came with an adrenaline rush. Mine didn't. That night, while he slept, I sat at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. I thought about the way he used to look at me in the first years, focused, hungry, like there was no one else in the room. I thought about how he looked at them now. I thought about the fact that maybe the man I loved had only existed because the marriage was new enough to feed him, and once that wore off, he needed something else. The kind of something else I could never be. In the morning, he tried to act like it was a normal day. He made coffee, asked about my plans, told me we could take a trip next month, just us. The words were soft measured, but they slid right over me. I didn't answer until he finally asked if I was going to say anything. I told him there wasn't anything left to say. He leaned against the counter, studying me like I was the one who'd changed. In a way, he was right. I wasn't the same woman who had agreed to that first meeting, or the one who'd tried to believe his explanations. I'd stopped being part of his story and started writing my own. I didn't slam doors or throw accusations. I packed quietly, methodically. My suitcase was in the car before he even realized I was leaving. I left a note on the counter, not a goodbye, not an explanation. Just a line that had been in my head since Rachel's call. Some things you can't come back from. Driving away, I didn't feel free, not yet. I felt hollow, like I'd been emptied out over months until there was nothing left to carry. But underneath that emptiness was a strange clarity. I knew that even if he ended it with them, even if he begged, the version of us that existed before his fantasy began was gone. Trust doesn't grow back the same way once it's been cut at the root. As the city faded in my rearview mirror, I realized that maybe this had always been his truth. and our marriage was just a fantasy. A beautiful, convincing illusion that cracked the moment real life stopped exciting him. And now, with nothing left to salvage, the only thing that mattered was that I wasn't part of his story anymore. By the time weeks had passed, I'd grown used to the absence of his voice, the silence of my phone without his name lighting up the screen. At first, I thought the quiet would break me, that I'd start reaching for it out of habit. But it was different. It was clean, untainted. I could breathe without bracing for what I might overhear or discover. He tried a few times emails that read like apologies without actually saying the word. Messages about missing me, about wanting to talk. I didn't respond. The last thing I owed him was more of my attention. Rachel checked in once, careful not to mention his name unless I did first. She told me that he was still around the same crowd, still showing up at the same places, but now without the pretense of secrecy. It didn't shock me. His fantasy had become his life, and without me there to challenge it, he didn't have to hide. I wondered if that made it better for him, or if, without the tension of my presence, it had already started to lose its thrill. The more distance I put between myself and that life, the clearer the patterns became. He had built a version of himself that only existed in certain rooms with certain people. A man who was fun, daring, untethered. But that man couldn't survive the reality of bills, routines, quiet nights, and someone who knew him well enough to see the cracks. That's why. He needed them, not for who they were, but for the role they played in keeping his illusion alive. I had stopped playing along, and that made me disposable. I didn't waste time on revenge, or on trying to make him regret it. Regret is a currency people like him never really pay with. Instead, I focused on reclaiming my own space. I redecorated the apartment I'd moved into, not because I needed it to look different, but because I needed every corner to feel untouched by him. Even small things, a mug, a blanket, were replaced. Erasing him from my environment was easier than erasing him from my mind. But it was a start. Sometimes late at night, I'd catch myself remembering the version of us that worked, before lines blurred and trust bled out between us. I'd think about whether I could have done anything differently, shut down his first comment, refused to be part of his experiment, walked away sooner. But those thoughts always ended in the same place. None of it would have mattered. The choice to risk everything had been his alone, and the moment he made it, the outcome was already set. Months later, I saw him by accident, across the street outside a bar. He was with two of them, Clara and Sophie, and even from a distance, I could tell nothing had changed. He laughed, leaned in close, played the part I knew so well. But there was something in his face when he looked away, a flicker of emptiness. Between the performances, I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel sad. I felt nothing, and that nothing was its own kind of victory. He noticed me then, or maybe he sensed me before he saw me. Our eyes met for less than a second. No wave, no smile, just a recognition that we now belonged to entirely separate worlds. I turned away first, not because I couldn't look at him, but because there was nothing left to see. The real ending didn't come from leaving, or from him admitting what he'd done. It came from the day I stopped needing him to understand why I walked away. Some truths are for you alone, carried quietly, without the need for validation. His fantasy had been about control, about bending reality to fit his desires. My choice to leave had been about reclaiming mine. Looking back, I can see that the moment he first voiced it, that just a thought he dangled in the air, wasn't the beginning of a game. It was the first crack in the foundation. I stepped over it, thinking I could watch without falling through, but the ground was already gone. What's left now is solid, built without him, and I have no interest in testing its strength for anyone else's thrill. In the end, he got what he wanted, and so did I. The difference is, mine won't vanish the moment the novelty wears off.